I would say a common question that I get is, okay, I'm about to retire. I have several $100,000 in my 401k account. What should I do? Okay, and the basic answer that I have is that there are no good choices. And that's one of the problems. Okay, now you can keep investing it and hope that the stock market will be kind to you. But then, how much should you withdraw every year? Do you know when you're going to die? Are you your own actuary? Nobody knows that. So and then as you get older, you may be less capable of managing your own investment system. So the private sector has an answer to that, which is that you can turn your money over to them and they'll sell you an annuity. A life insurance company will do that. Okay, but the problem with the annuity is it's very expensive. They subtract commissions, they subtract fees, they're out there advertising. Okay, every time you see one of these 4-color ads in the New Yorker or elsewhere, who's paying for it? You're paying for it out of your money that's invested in these companies that run it. So they've kind of got you coming and going. Okay, that is, they're taking money during the accumulation phase, and then during the deaccumulation phase, they take more money. My solution, okay, which doesn't exist yet, okay, would be for Social Security to allow you to roll your 401k accumulation into it in return for a larger benefit check every month. That would be a much better deal because it would be essentially a nonprofit annuity. Okay, and then it would take advantage of the risk sharing, which is, I think, the primary advantage of pension funds.
Speaking of the audience, I see some interesting questions in the chat from members of the audience. I even recognize some of the people with these great questions. So I'm wondering if we could switch to that for a little bit and throw some of these in Jim's lap. There's 2 questions I see from folks in the clerical unit represented by the Teamsters in the UC system. One person questioning an apparent agreement that has encouraged what looks like lump sum cash outs. And someone else calling attention to the fact that the pension plan management for that bargaining unit has apparently been contracted out, used to be done in-house, I guess, in the state. Maybe Jim could kind of comment on those 2 issues in general. And then I also see a very good question from a retired Oakland teacher wanting to know what we think about activist investing strategies, pension plans divesting from fossil fuel stocks and being socially responsible investors on behalf of their plan participants in other ways. I think the clerical worker questions, since they're close to home out here in California, would be of interest. Jim, do you have any thoughts about?
Well, I'm not a great fan of cash outs. I think that one of the real important benefits of a pension is that it gives you income for life. And if you can't take a cash out, then you're the one who's responsible for managing that for the rest of your life, so you don't run out of money. And it's a kind of a gamble in that way. I mean, it might work, might not work. Much better to have something that's a secure payment that you can adapt to over time. As far as the whole question of leveraging pension funds for social purposes, there is a book called Labor's Capital, which discusses all of that. A lot of it gets into very knotty issues, though, of fiduciary responsibility of pension funds, whether they can invest in things that may make sense from the point of view of labor, but don't necessarily deliver the highest return to workers. And so that's I think, a kind of gray area as far as what can be done with it.
Can I address those questions a little bit? And I'm obviously in UC, but in terms of cash outs, I actually just got a very similar question from actually a Kaiser health worker who's part of IFPTE in California, and it's really interesting. There's basically all kinds of terrible sort of retail street level financial wisdom out there that's actually not wisdom at all. So workers really think that they can take a pension. So for instance, a UC pension, if you take a cash out, you're essentially taking a 7% a year, right? Guarantee. That's how it's priced according to their expected rate of return. So you cannot get a 7% return guarantee anywhere in the market, nowhere, right? So, and certainly super low fees and all of that. So you just, basically what I tell people is, unless you have cancer, like that you have very short life expectancy, do not take the lump sum cash out because it's a very bad deal. And there's a whole industry of people out there essentially trying to peddle products. They're really essentially saying, take a lump sum and you can invest it in my annuity, right? That looks really good on the surface, but you dig in and there are really high fees and it's just a terrible deal. And just to let you know, there is some awareness of this at the federal level that retirees are not getting good advice on the cash out decision. And with regard to kind of the labor's capital issue, and it's important to know that, especially in terms of the attack on public pension funds, because, right, these funds have worker representation, often worker representation on the boards of trustees. And because, CalPERS is one of the largest institutional investors in the world alongside CalSTRS. And so they're going in with shareholder resolutions on corporate pay, CEO pay and things like that, and sort of environmental policies. So it's really clearly the sort of the subtext is obviously destroy unions, and also that workers' voices have no room in the corporate boardroom, right, in corporate governance and any of these decisions. And you contrast that to like George Bush's notion. Do you remember the ownership society, right? Because I've got some mutual fund that I am now an owner of capital, when I actually have no say, that in these large pension funds, that workers actually do have a say in how that capital is managed. And that's one of the reasons that these public pensions are under attack. So I'll talk about sort of underfunding in private pension funds. And there's sort of two, there's a single employer plans, which are the corporate DB plans, and then the multi-employer plans, which tend to be sort of Taft-Hartley union trusts. So there is the Pension Protection Act of 2006, which sort of actually was supposed to bolster private sector pension funding, but had the effect of basically accelerating corporations dumping plans, because what it did was say that you have to use the risk-free kind of low interest discount rate to fund your pension every year. And that basically, one of the things that it did was and sort of market valuation of assets with virtually no smoothing, which public pensions do smoothing over 3 or 7 years. What that meant was that annual funding requirements just were all over the place, right? It was really unpredictable. So it made plans even less attractive to keep sponsoring for private employers. And then we have the multi-employer plans. And I see people in the audience here who know a lot more about this than me, but one of the challenges is that these are supposed to be, large pools of workers in entire industries. And so the rationale is, well, we are sort of self-insuring. We don't have to pay as high a premium to the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, which is essentially the kind of the federal insurance company that backstops all private pensions. And so we know what happened to a lot of these industries. The demographics just got turned upside down. They entered a sort of death spiral in terms of funding. And so, and that is a story that is in Jim's book, right? In terms of some of essentially kind of the saga of kind of the struggles over, should these or can these benefits be cut? And then, the real win was that basically in the last stimulus package, right, there was a federal bailout. And I will tell you, I was at a House committee hearing where the Republicans were, it's just angry, really, really angry about that. And the cost of that bailout was basically a fraction of what the US spends every year subsidizing the retirement accounts of the top 20% of earners in this country. So to me, it seemed like a good deal. So this is, so it sort of raises this issue of that we do need sort of good systems in place to make sure private and public pensions are well funded. And at the same time that this is, I think there is a really good, the Republicans are really terrified of the federal government bailing out public pensions. And I think, and also private pensions. And I think there's a really strong kind of organizing moment here. And I think the labor movement was extremely successful, right? This is a really huge win in preserving the benefits of, I forget what the number of retirees was, but basically they were looking at huge haircuts for their benefits, and they managed to avoid that. So I'll stop there.
The problem is like with the Uber drivers, who's going to pay the employer side of it? And I think it's really quite unfair for gig workers to have to pay both sides of that. And what should happen is that in some way the rest of Social Security subsidizes that, so that people would pay the same amount that everybody else does, 6.2% of income. Now, have to realize also that that's one of the major arguments for 401ks, is that they're very flexible and very portable, okay, which is true. They are portable. I mean, you can go from an employer to employer to employer, and the answer they would say is, well, the gig worker ought to open up an IRA, individual retirement account, and then start saving their money. Okay, the problem there is it just doesn't work. I mean, you can save money, but you're not going to be able to save enough to have a reasonable retirement income.
One of the points I always make when I talk about this issue is that we have a US, basically American retirement system outside of Social Security assumes either that you basically are employed by a firm, right? Employee-firm, employer-employee relationship, or that you're sort of a self-employed entrepreneur, right? And then you'll go out and open up an IRA. And so one of the points I always make is that there's just huge segments who they just don't fit in that mold, right? So I'll go back to home care workers. We've got 1 million home care workers in this country who work for a client, right? So they're employed by a family or a disabled person who's not going to have the wherewithal to set up, any kind of retirement plan, right, for their caregiver. So they just have nowhere to turn in terms of even thinking about trying to get a retirement benefit. So I do think that this is one of the reasons I keep going back to Social Security, is that it's sort of the easiest place to capture a share of people's earnings and to accumulate benefits, because the current system as designed, what to tell you, like I've consulted with domestic workers unions and other care workers, domestic and care workers unions who are sort of dealing with this because they don't fit into these boxes that the federal government has set up. There's just really nowhere for them to turn. And so I think having, even if it's a parallel program to Social Security, it's like we already have a system for collecting payroll taxes, right? And the other thing too is that other countries have, notions of a dependent contractor, right? So the notion is that if you're a company and you're paying somebody as an independent contractor, and you're basically their sole source of income, that you have to make retirement contributions for them, right? And I do think that this is a struggle that the labor movement is having with regulators. It's an internal struggle within the labor movement ideologically about what to do about modernizing labor laws to reflect what's happening today. Whether we sort of try to stick it out and try to cram workers into the boxes that we have, or to try to come up with sort of new laws. But as it is right now, a lot of workers just kind of stuck outside the system. There's a really great question right off the bat, which is in view of the demise of private DB pensions, plans for most of today's workers, should Social Security retirement benefits be enhanced to help fill the DB pension gap? And I would say, I had a Facebook post recently just because I was so inspired. I actually had a conversation via email with a chief actuary at Social Security because I was modeling benefits for a study, and kind of got really deep in the weeds and realized that the system is so much more progressive than most people understand. So we understand sort of intuitively that replacement rates are higher, right? That low wage workers get sort of a bigger benefit in relation to their lifetime earnings than middle wage and high wage workers do. But there are other sort of technical aspects that I'm not going to kind of dive into, but what it does is basically it makes sure that benefits actually keep pace with the generational standards of living, which no other system really does. And then there's a full COLA, right? So we had a high inflation year, and now retirees are getting, over 5% COLA increase. My mother is actually really looking forward to that, and I'm sure a lot of other beneficiaries are too. So this, I think, is really kind of is a real jewel that we need to protect and find ways to expand. And the other thing is that there's a whole group of workers who were never included in the DB pension world, are not getting even 401k. They're just completely left out of the system, right? So they're the workers who are left out of things like the Fair Labor Standards Act, right? Sort of domestic workers. It sort of percolates down today to home care workers, and it's sort of non-standard workers, gig workers. There are a bunch of workers who just don't fit into the system in any way, and all they have is Social Security. So when we talk about sort of actually having universal retirement security in the United States for all workers, that Social Security is really the first thing that we need to be talking about. Get off my soapbox.
Yeah, the hackneyed phrase is the three-legged stool. Like that's what you're supposed to have: Social Security, a defined benefit pension, and then private savings. And then what's happened is they collapse the second and the third into one. So it's just Social Security and savings account, which is what the 401k is. Okay. I did some looking at countries, with different systems. Okay. And most of the countries that have the most generous retirement systems just have a single system. Okay. They don't have a three-legged stool or anything like that. They have, it's one giant Social Security system, and that's what people live on. And that's the direction that I think we need to move on. I mean, it's a lot like Medicare for all, Social Security for all. I mean, anybody who really studies Social Security, and the people who put it together in the 1930s with forerunners in the 20s and the 10s and the aughts, building on the German system, okay, realizes just how far thinking they were with it, okay, and that it works very well as long as you keep, the types of reforms along the way that need to be done to keep everything in balance, okay, which is now they're playing this game of chicken in Washington in terms of, trying to see if Congress does absolutely nothing with Social Security, then it'll force a crisis, in 2032, something like that. Okay, but it's very easy to keep adjusting it along the way. And if you ask me what I would like to do, I would like to do away with employer plans and have just everybody in Social Security, maybe at different levels where people could put their savings accounts in it. Yeah, I'll throw in a comment about the last question about the cap on Social Security income that's taxed, which I think it's 148,000 now, which probably for most people watching this is all of their income. It falls under $148,000. Okay, but for rich people, that's a very small amount if you're talking about the 1%. So, the question is why should there be any cap at all? Okay, why shouldn't it just be wide open? It is for Medicare, okay, for labor income. But here's again the subtlety that you may not be thinking about is that for rich people, especially when you get to over $400,000 income, most of their income doesn't come from labor income, it comes from investment income. And Social Security could get a lot more revenue out of beginning to tax investment income than it can from raising the cap. I mean, I think that the cap should be raised, but in addition to it, there should be the taxing of capital, okay, capital income. Yeah, I think it's a question of kind of where you're at in this. I mean, most people, let's say half of people have nothing, okay, in terms of retirement plan. Let's start with that. Okay, and so they should either be fighting for some sort of employer plan where they are, or an expansion of Social Security, one or the other. Then the biggest percentage of people who have a plan have something like a 401k, okay, of which they vary tremendously between ones where the employer makes no contribution to it whatsoever, to ones that they contribute as much as 15 or 20%. Okay, by the way, okay, I did the calculations. And if you want to know how much you have to put into a 401k, okay, I calculate it's between 25 and 30%. Okay. I can see the stunned looks, okay, that are out there because nobody can do that, right? So I think it's an impossible system. Okay, if you were going to try to match what you could get in a defined benefit plan, you would have to put in 25 to 30%. So, that's the situation for them, or look for a different job, that has a decent plan. Okay. Now, another possibility is if you're in a 401k, is to start thinking along the lines of the annuity reform. Okay, is there a way to reform annuities so that I can stay in my 401k, but then get a decent, annuity out of it? And that's where I think Social Security could solve that problem for a lot of people. If you're in a defined benefit plan, fight like the Dickens for it, and also fight to improve it, because every plan can be improved. Right now, everybody's defensive about these things. Okay, but there are a lot of improvements that don't necessarily cost the employer of the plan anything. Okay, for example, if you've spent 15 years in a 401k and then you get a job in a defined benefit that comes with a pension plan, you should be able to purchase service credits, meaning that you should be able to roll that 401k into it to get 5 years, 10 years, 15 years credit, which would be good for you. But not all plans have that feature. Okay, but it doesn't cost them anything to put that feature in, okay, because you can make it actuarially neutral. So there are a lot of reforms that if you understand the system, you should not have a whole lot of opposition from employers.
So here we are at the end of our time together. And of course, as you might have expected, you get all of the advice in the last 5 minutes that you needed. So I'm going to prompt everybody to watch the whole thing so they can get to Jim's, choice advice at the end.
I want to thank everybody else for their great contributions and put in another plug for Jim's terrific book. We need it in every labor education program in the country. We need it in every local union library. We need a lot more labor publications reviewing it, and a lot more people going into bargaining about pensions and other issues, reading it before they get to the table and have to deal with employers who are often better prepared than they are.